So there's this lack of knowledge about franchising that we have faced forever. But that also isn't the onus on you, the investor, the potential franchisee, to go find out something about it. You can learn about it.
Absolutely. Look, I have never, people argue, well, Keith, it's not all the franchisor's fault. And I go, I've never said that. There's blame on both sides. I think, doing due diligence is obviously important and trying to understand. And look, first page of the FDD states you should hire an attorney.
Welcome to the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast, where we talk about all things franchising. Now, here's your host, Dr. John P. Hayes.
Hi, it's John Hayes, another episode of the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast, and my guest is Keith Miller. He's the founder of the Franchisee Advocacy Consulting Group, representing franchisees, not franchisors, and has an interesting take on franchising. Keith you either lead now or you have led several groups, franchisee advocacy groups, including the American Association of Franchisees and Dealers, the Coalition of Franchise Associations, the North American Association of Subway Franchisees, because you and your wife, Karen, are Subway franchisees, have been since 1988. You're very well respected among peers and adversaries as well. You're respected by the International Franchise Association, by franchisors who you occasionally might oppose, and you're fighting, and by that word I mean you're advocating for franchisees, which you point out is the largest investor group in franchising, but has the weakest voice. You've been doing this a long time, and I thank you, Keith, for joining me. And I want to begin right away by asking you, why, in America, the most heavily regulated country for franchising, why do we need more regulation to protect franchisees?
Well, first of all, thank you, John, for having me today. And I would probably argue that it's not the most regulated industry in the country. And while I'm from California, which is probably the most regulated state in the union also, we've even outlawed humidity, so not everything is bad that we come up with. But it still really is, when you look at other regulated industries, if you look at the securities industries, and most regulations look at protecting the investor, number one, right? You protect the investor's money. But in franchising, of course, franchisees, while they're a heavy investor, they're not shareholders, therefore aren't equally protected as shareholders. They're stakeholders in the industry. We talk about being so heavily regulated, and I say, where are we heavily regulated? The FTC does have a franchise rule, which of course is the pre-sale disclosure part of it, but it's only been enforced twice in the last 17 years. So even if you have, quote, heavy regulations, if they're not enforced, are they really heavily regulated? Obviously, this current FTC under the Biden administration has taken an interest in franchising. I would argue before Rohit Chopra in 2020 mentioned the word franchise and started becoming interested in it, that the FTC commissioners haven't even uttered that word for probably a decade. So, and again, it's not about over-regulating business, because most franchise owners aren't in favor of heavy regulation. But when we keep seeing examples of, I guess, poor actors, and I don't want to paint a brush that the whole industry is full of bad actors, but I think even, I guess, the pro-franchisor side would say we do have too many bad actors that we need to figure out how to fix that.
Okay, so we'll come back to that. There are a couple of other things I wanted to ask you. You have an MBA, you have a background, I think, in computer science. Yeah, am I right about that?
Correct.
Yeah. Do you have a law degree?
No, and I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. I absorb a lot well, and I've talked to a lot of lawyers over the time, over the 20-something years, I guess I've been, it's more than 20-something years advocating on behalf of franchisees. Besides just being a franchisee, I believe you and I probably had different hair color when we both got started.
Exactly, right.
But the good news is we still have hair.
Exactly. Well, that was an interesting thing to me. I thought, well, where's his law degree from? Because I think of you as an attorney. I think everybody does when you're on a panel or when you're talking about franchising, but not a lawyer. And it's not good, not bad, just a point of information.
I was going to say, is that a compliment or not?
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
Exactly. So you and your wife became franchisees 1988, but why? How did you discover franchising? You were in computer science, you had an MBA. I don't know about your wife's background, but what led to franchising?
What the hell were we thinking?
Yeah.
She actually has also a computer science degree and an MBA too. And I think, like a lot of people, we wanted to own our own business at some point. We're in the, I guess you'd call the rat race of Silicon Valley. And it wasn't that was bad, but we're looking around and getting that age of you're going to have a family. And it's like, I'm not sure this is where I want to be and have a family. And, in the San Jose, Santa Clara, we're actually living in Sunnyvale, which is one of the nicer towns in Silicon Valley. But just didn't necessarily want to raise a family there, wanted to move out of that area. How are we going to accomplish that? And looking at operating your own business. And part of the thinking, when it comes into part of my working on why protect franchisees, we were doing this at 28 years old. We had computer science degrees.
Okay.
If we failed, we were okay, right? We'd go back to the industry. And I look at so much of franchising now are going after retirees, and you worry about, okay, if they fail, now what happens? If they lose their investment? If I lost my retirement funds, which I didn't have much, building up at 28 years old, I have a lot of time to recover, and I had skills that I could. So, you're looking at moving out, and we started looking at franchises going. Actually, the funny part is, knowing I'm a Subway franchisee, the first one we looked at was Togo's, a competitor of Subway, because Togo's was king in Silicon Valley. That was where it was started, and it had some outlets that were unbelievably busy, right? You'd go at lunch, and they'd have 10 lines going 10 deep, people coming up to the line. So that was kind of, I guess, where we started looking at franchising. We knew where we kind of wanted to move up in the area around Auburn, California, which we're within 10 miles of now. But Togo's didn't have any available territories.
Wow.
And so we also used to stop at the Subway shop on the way home and ran into the owner there, who was also the development agent, way back, one of the early development agents. And, we looked at some other franchises, not so much to buy, but kind of for interest. We sent to McDonald's for an information packet, to Taco Bell. And I remember the Taco Bell one having some ridiculous numbers like, you must have a net worth of, $5 million because we want you to. And I'm kind of like at 28 years old going, if I have a net worth of $5 million, why am I investing in a taco stand? Yeah. So anyway, it got to Subway being something that was very affordable. Most people know Subway. I compare it to like a loan. We had a low buy-in rate. The franchise fee was fairly low. I think it was $7,500 back then.
Right, at that time it was.
At that time, but 8% royalties. So you got a low, you paid it high in rate and low on down payment type of thing. And again, it was something we could accomplish. And so we took that leap.
And how many Subways have you owned? And you still own multiple?
Yeah, we still own 3, and they're the 3 that we originally built out. We had up to 6 at one time, all the way up to Reno, which is about an hour and a half away. And, that drive gets old over the mountains.
Yeah, I would guess. So the curious thing about Subway, and a lot of my listeners know that I wrote Fred DeLuca's book, Start Small, Finish Big. I knew Fred about the time you became a franchisee is when I met Fred, and he was franchisee of the year somewhere in the late 80s of the International Franchise Association. And I never say that we were friends. We were acquaintances for many, many, many years, including the book came out in 2000 and it took me about 2 years to write that book, much longer than it should have taken for lots of reasons, mainly Fred and his ideas and changes and personality and so forth. But one of the curious things to me, I teach the A to Z's of buying a franchise at expos across the country, have done that since the late 1980s, and people will come up to me and say, can you help me get a Subway? And all during that time, Subway was always controversial. People were losing money. I did a lot of interviews with Subway franchisees through the years, and I knew development agents, particularly the one where I lived in Dallas at the time. And the development agents made a lot of money. I think that's where lots of millionaires were created among development agents, but they were also scared to death of losing that opportunity. And there's so much controversy surrounding the brand, and a lot of people who, as if they were franchisees operating one or two, were working all the time and not making enough money. Was that your experience? And what I'm trying to get at is, why did so many people join this network and it became the world's largest franchise network? So it had to be lots of good to it as well.
You know, I've often told people, I go, Subway is the best and the worst of franchising all rolled into one. And it really is true. You know, they obviously, everyone knows they built too many stores, right? Fred's goal at that time was grow, grow, grow. Right. And the development agents were incentivized on growing. And so you kind of get in this, I don't want to use the word Ponzi scheme because that implies something was illegal. Right. But, you know, you were always trying to stay ahead of it, so you kept building a new one and building a new one and building a new one. And, you know, much like people buying spec houses, as you keep going, it's great, but you're really on the edge in a lot of ways. You're right. There was a lot of B and C locations because of this to grow. It's like grow anywhere, right? And a lot of people didn't make it, especially people who took debt. And I think that's one of the things that people really need to look at when they're looking at franchising, and I think is poorly disclosed, whether it was Subway failures or other failures, is they really don't account for the paying down the debt and that cost in there. Yeah, I'm profitable, but geez, paying down this debt makes my cash flow upside down. You know, we had peaks and valleys. In the early 90s, things were pretty good. Around 97, 98, things got really bad. In the early 2000s, when we had that character that is no longer around, you know, what people forget was at the same time, we had actually started a low-fat campaign before him, before advertising him. We had also, in 2000, made a lot of changes to our old sandwich. You know, we went to hinge cut instead of U-gouge, and we started not having setups and laying the meat on. We had seasoned breads, we had all these flavored sauces coming in. And so in 2001, we actually saw sales growth of 20-something%. So we had a few years of what I would call, we actually grabbed all the low-hanging fruit and we're off and running. And, you know, in like a lot of industries, momentum's a funny thing, right? When you have momentum, you can probably do stupid things and still be going pretty good for a while. When you don't have momentum, you have to do a whole bunch of really smart things to get out of it. And it's just kind of a tough thing to overcome. You know, we were starting to struggle in the mid-2000s again. And, you know, that was when we had the fight over the advertising budget, who controlled it, because Subway was unique that the franchisees actually owned, not just controlled, owned the advertising budget. Mm-hmm. And in 2006, that change was made to the franchise agreements to start putting corporate in control of it. I might be a little biased in my comments on this. You know, $5 footlong was an amazing thing, right? I mean, when we came out, what was that, 2007, 2008, yeah. Which the franchisees at that point, through the legal battles, were still running the advertising fund, was really kind of an amazing thing that was going on, and sales were great. But like many great promotions, you keep falling into that line of cocaine, so to speak. And it ultimately, probably $5 footlong, well, it saved us at one point, probably ultimately killed us because we got recognized as the cheap, low-cost carrier and we could never raise prices. And then sales started dropping.
How's the network today of Subway? Been sold, of course, and Fred unfortunately died way too early. And the new ownership has made some changes. There have been a shrinkage of units. What's happening now with Subway?
Well, so as you say, Fred passed away in 2015. The DeLucas and Bucks maintained ownership, actually, of Subway until April 30th of 2024. And Rourke Capital bought Subway. The transaction was finalized on that date. It took about 8 months to get that finalized. But new leadership was brought in 2019 with the sole purpose of getting the brand ready to sell. We had already started losing units in that time, and we have continued, quite frankly, to lose units. And unfortunately, I believe we'll continue to lose units because there are mandatory remodels coming up, which is obviously one of the things as an advocate I really try to look at. That, I mean, we all need remodels at some time, right? You and I probably both have owned a pastel green or orange leisure suit from the 70s. And even if it's in perfect condition, if it actually fit, we're probably not wearing it anywhere, right, except for Halloween. And so updates need to happen. But from a franchisee point of view, and again, I'm biased on this, I believe almost all the decisions being made by the company were getting it prepared to sell. And it sold. The reality is this transformation, as we keep hearing it called in the press, that they've transformed us and we're doing all these different things. AUVs are still not up. They're still probably somewhere around 2011 year data, volumes. Stores aren't really profitable. Therefore, they can't do remodels. I mean, if a store is not profitable or making $20,000 a year profit, you're not going to do a $100,000 remodel. The math doesn't work. Right. Mm-hmm. And the reality is most stores have no value. You literally can't sell them for $50,000. So from a franchisee perspective, and this may get me in a little trouble, but profit from the transformation is met, profits are down, and the equity in our stores is down and next to nothing.
So you should have bought Jersey Mike's, I guess.
Yeah, or sold to, where I kicked myself, and I guess it's a lesson of not having a good plan to get out of things. 12, 15 years ago, should have sold when it was good, but when times are good, you're making money, and it's like, I don't want to sell. And then it's like a stock, I guess, Yeah. It's like by the time you realize, oh damn, it's too late, and now you've lost your value.
Yeah, I've always said franchising is like the stock market. You've got to know when to buy and you've got to know when to sell, and you can't let your emotions get in the way. Easier said than done. Looking at franchising broadly again, what, in your opinion, are the top 3 areas, doesn't matter, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 5, whatever you want to talk about, where franchisees are the most vulnerable?
I think in the beginning, before they actually buy, and then up to when they sign the paper. And you won't like this, I always say there's too many people in the industry selling franchises and not enough people in the industry making sure franchisees are successful.
Very good point.
And of course the IFA will argue, well, franchising's not an industry, it's a model. I disagree with that. I think it's both a model and an industry, because the art and the process of selling franchises is definitely an industry. You'll have many of them at a class later this month. Selling franchises is an industry. So I think because you have so many people sell, I think things get not always truthful in things. I mean, I see it almost every day on LinkedIn, people claiming that franchising is far more safe than opening an independent, it's more successful, and yet none of these people can link to any research that has said that, because there's not. And even the IFA admits you should not use numbers that franchising is 90% successful versus independence 50%. So I think people who are knowledgeable know that's not truthful, but yet we know we see it every day in comments. So obviously then, because they know nothing about franchising, and hey, I joined the group in 1988. I signed a franchise agreement, not knowing a damn thing about franchising, and you know, I always laugh. Aziz Hashim, who is probably one of the most respected people in franchising and past chair of the IFA, I consider top 5 smartest people in franchising. If you ask him what he knew when he bought his first franchise, he'll flat tell you, I was an idiot. I was just lucky I survived, so I had enough chance, in a sense, to have the knowledge. And I think that's true of a lot of us who have done okay. We didn't know what we didn't know. We were stupid in the beginning, but we survived it anyway. So I think, you know, that's probably, you know, one of the biggest areas of strain. I think then you start looking at what franchising promises and does it really all the time. Proven business model. What the heck does that mean? You know, and it's fairly public, I'm a supporter of mandated item 19 financial representations. And one of my arguments to that is, if you can't document it, how can you call yourself a proven business model? And I think we have a lot of brands out there. I throw numbers, you know, I have no data on this, but I would guess that at least 50%, maybe even more, of franchises shouldn't even be being sold as franchises.
Wow.
And that you have, well, you know, there's a lot of brands out there with less than 10 outlets, and some of them may become successful. Again, I don't have data, you know, it might be 30%, it might be 70%. But too many are being sold under what I would call the cover of franchising, right? Because you call yourself a franchise, and now you're implying you're a proven business model, and all these other things that come with franchising. Group purchasing power has become, the supply chains have become a profit center for franchisors, and the illusion of group purchasing power seems to be lost in a lot of ways, which is sad. And, you know, it's like, how do you, and part of the thing is when you look back, you know, when you and I got into franchising, we had the Fred DeLucas, you know, you had Rosenberg's running Duncan, and you had what I would call true founders. We really don't have true founders very often running franchises anymore. Obviously, the early franchises, they've passed on. And I see so many brands, franchises created today, not as a brand, but being created as a franchise. You know, they're literally something on paper, and they start selling a franchise and don't even have a company outlet open. And yes, I guess they're founders of that, but let's face it, that's a different type of founder than a DeLuca, Ray Kroc, Rosenberg with Duncan. Much different founders who bled the blood of their brand.
So one of the areas that you point out is that people don't know anything about franchising, which is part of the reason why there's the popular program at Palm Beach Atlantic called the Concentration in Franchising. I've been very fortunate in the last 8 years to attract students who want to know about franchising, even though they don't come to the university to study it because not many opportunities to do that. So there's this lack of knowledge about franchising that we have faced forever. But that also isn't the onus on you, the investor, the potential franchisee, to go find out something about it. You can learn about it.
Absolutely. You know, look, I have never, people argue, well, Keith, it's not all the franchisor's fault. And I go, I've never said that. You know, there's blame on both sides. You know, I think, you know, doing due diligence is obviously important and trying to understand. And look, first page of the FDD states you should hire an attorney. And the thing that people most often missed in very bold print, because it has to be in bold print, is no governmental agency has reviewed this document. I think it's too easy, in a sense, to become a franchise and sell, especially if you're selling in states that don't have a registration requirement. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that's kind of one of my red flags. I'll go, oh, this franchise is selling in like 35 states. none of them are registration states.
Right.
That's interesting. So, but we have a perception problem because you get this, 2, 3, 4, 500-page document, and people will go, well, you have a responsibility to read that. And lawyers will say this, and I always ask every lawyer, so did you read your complete mortgage document, or just start signing, right? And I can't find a lawyer who said they did read the whole thing either. So, you put a big... But even though it says no governmental agency has reviewed it, and by the way, the FTC doesn't even collect the FDDs. I have more than once gotten mad at franchisor representatives who are selling franchises that, well, we have registered our FDD with the FTC. It's like, no, you have not. There is no registration. But you get this big document, so you still have the feeling that somebody's looking at it, right? Regulating it. And then on top of that, especially weaker brands tend to lean to SBA loans or the ROBS program where you're rolling over your retirement. And you're going, wait a minute, the government requires this big document. The government will guarantee my loan. Surely someone has looked at this business.
Yeah.
And the answer is no. And I think that's probably the biggest thing of education is not the actual education, but the education of no, just because you have a big document doesn't mean it's a proven business model. If you're buying into a chain of under 10 outlets, you should know it's a startup, right? And startups have a high risk of failure.
Yeah.
One of the things when you talk about success in businesses and the, word on the street is always, well, franchises are more successful. And I go, well, how do you define success, first of all? And some people say, well, it's been open for 5 years. If you do an independent business, if I opened up Keith's Subs and 2 years in, I was not making money. I don't know what my lease obligation would, but in general, I'd shut down the unit, right? And run like heck out of there. You can't close a franchise in general. You have liquidated damages, and so sometimes on really bad brands over a 5-year period, you may see that the initial guy invested $500,000. He wasn't making money. He now sold it for $200,000 to get out from under it. And now a third person has bought it for $50,000. And so in 5 years, you would say, well, it's still open. It's successful. And I think you and I would agree that's not success.
So should there be a rule at the FTC level that if you're going to buy a franchise, you've got to take a course. You've got to read this program. You've got to take this test. You've got to have an education in franchising before you invest, whether it's $50,000 or $500,000.
Interesting. That would be, you see, and I probably lean more of putting more liability on brokers, which of course a broker bill was passed in California, and a lot of people aren't happy about that.
Yeah.
I would hope, to me, the main thing is they need to go talk to a lawyer, a franchise lawyer, not their lawyer who did their will down the street.
Yeah.
I don't know, how long would the class have to be and all of that. I mean, yes, there should be some education, and it should be harder to buy a franchise, I guess. Okay. It's, the other side of it is I always get franchisors will complain to me, well, these were bad franchisees. And I always chuckle at them and say, why are you asking me about them? You approved them and cashed the check. And so I always like going back to a quote that was attributed to Nigel Travis at Duncan when he told a group of franchisors, you have the franchisees you deserve. And so, because you approve them and you take their check. And I think you and I know there's far too many brands that did sell to literally anyone because they had the money to write the check. So
are there bad franchisees just as there are bad franchisors?
Of course there are. Absolutely. We're all human beings, right? There's a percentage of good human beings and bad human beings out there. I don't know why. And people do bad things. People also do bad things when they're backed into a corner. And so the answer is absolutely there's bad franchisees. Mm-hmm. There's dishonest franchisees. There's dishonest franchisors, right? And then you have franchisees who probably were good at heart, maybe in over their head and then start doing bad things. When the Quiznos collapse was coming or in process, people would say, well, we think one of the problems are people are underreporting sales and they're not paying their full royalties. And I kind of go, people do out of character things sometimes when their back's against the wall. If I had the choice of I had $1,000 to my name this month, and I had the choice of paying $1,000 to the franchisor, even though I owed that $1,000, or I needed that $1,000 to put food on the table of my family, might I do something wrong to make sure I have food on the table of my family? So, it's a whole mix. It's like the rest of society. You have a whole mix of things.
Well, there are franchisors who are not well-intended. We know this. I don't know if they start out that way or if they just turn that way, because as IFA and others point out, most franchisors never get to 100 units. They're still in that maybe 5 units, maybe up to 50, 60 units, probably not making money. And when a franchisee comes to me and says, can you help me in this situation, or what do you advise? I bought into this and it's upside down and I owe a lot of money and I don't know how to get out of it. My first question is often, and I try to be kind, why did you do such a dumb thing? Why did you invest in this without doing some homework? First of all, you're not even a good match for franchising. And I do believe there are some people better at franchising than other people are going to be at franchising. And then you bought into a business where, they got 6 units or they have 16 units. There's no proof of the business plan here. Why did you do this? And of course they did it for all kinds of reasons. Still, it goes back. You're dumbfounded at points.
Boy, you opened a broad subject there. First of all, I think most of us know most brands need to get to 75, 80, somewhere just south but pushing 100 to become self-sufficient, where they can run their operation on royalties versus having to sell something this month to make their payroll, the franchisor payroll. So when they have 10 units, they have to try to sell, because that's the only way for them to pay the bills. Well, the problem is if they're not selling, now they're trying to figure out how to get more revenue out of their franchisees, because they're back. I just described backs against the wall of a franchisee. Franchisors have their backs against the wall. And look, all failed brands aren't because the franchisor is evil. Franchisors, I often have to tell people that, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but, making a dumb business decision by a franchisor is not illegal, right? They may have had good intentions. I mean, look at marketing decisions. What's the batting average on marketing decisions? If you bat .333, you're in the Hall of Fame, right? It's like baseball. And so, you have a lot of the struggles. What really concerns me is that people, and in some ways, I can't blame the people selling the franchises, but when you look at somebody and they're going all in with their assets, that's a bad recipe, right? I see so many brands that maybe could make it if they didn't start underwater, the franchisees. And why don't you ask me earlier, what are some of the really bad things or kind of the problem areas? And one of them is the underestimation of what it costs to get open. I see that so often, especially in brick and mortar type outlets or brands. And first of all, the FTC requires you to give a range. Here's one of the problems I have with the disclosure document. It'll say, let's just say the range is from 300,000 or 100,000 to 500,000. Yeah, but I'll bet you 90% of those are around 450 to 500,000. And yet most people would look at that number and go, oh, the average is 300,000. I'm going to budget 300,000. And so that's wrong. And then I often see franchisors so often are underestimating that cost. So the 100 to 500,000 doesn't average 300,000. It averages 500,000, and there's a whole bunch of units now being built for 700,000. Well, people have budgeted what assets they have. They've gone and gotten loans for thinking 300,000, maybe 400,000. So the day they open, they're so far underwater because they've tapped into credit cards, home equity lines, everything else. It's a failure from the beginning. And I think there needs to be a lot more honesty, I guess, that the 100,000 was one rare conversion that we were able to convert and open because it was a like business for 100,000. But if you're building a new one, this is what it really cost.
Why was the California broker bill so controversial? It's not complex what it requires of brokers, and yet a lot of controversy about that. Yeah, a lot of unhappy people. Now, you were in favor of it, understandably, but why is this such an issue?
I don't know. You ask them. I think it's a fairly simple issue. Look, people selling stocks and bonds have to be licensed. We didn't even ask to be licensed, right? I actually think there's a licensing requirement needed and even more transparency. This is kind of a stake in the ground bill from my perception. You look at, again, the SEC requires licensing to sell stocks and bonds and any kind of security. Yet, buying a franchise is actually much more risk on you than buying any security. I often testify, if you buy a stock for $100,000, what's your risk? Well, worst case, you lose $100,000. Well, what's your risk if you invest $100,000 to buy a franchise? And here's what people don't get. It's every asset you own. Because you've probably signed a personal guarantee. You have loss of income if you're working in the business. If you take out an SBA loan, that SBA loan has a personal guarantee. They literally can come after every asset you own. And yet, what's the requirement to sell a franchise? Nothing. I testified multiple committees in favor of the bill, and one of my cracks in it was, in fact, it is so easy to become a franchise broker that all of you senators can become one by the time I finish this sentence, simply by calling yourself one. And so, the term broker, I think, has some inherent expectations, right, that we don't follow in franchising. We kind of compare it, it's this fight of, are they like a real estate broker? And, sometimes the brokers group will say, well, we're like a real estate broker, but then we're not like a real estate broker. And so I get that it's different, but the term broker implies some level of education. Now, there are broker groups, and there are some broker groups that were in favor of this bill, and there are broker groups out there that require education, and I think that's good. We had some saying, well, we're really just like a greeter. We got the one with, we're a greeter like at an Apple store. And I chuckled at that one. I go, does the greeter at the Apple store get 50% of what when you buy the Apple phone? Yeah. These people are getting 50% or more sometimes of the franchise fee. They're heavily, call it a consultant, broker, whatever, and I get that they're all doing something slightly different, but they're all heavily involved with the sales process. The other part that I think was still lacking in somewhat is all of the transparency, not just the transparency between that person selling the franchise and the franchisor, but are they also getting commissions, rebates, kickbacks, whatever term you want to use, from a lawyer that they're referring you to? So is that lawyer really the best lawyer for you? Or the one I see is the loan consultants of helping you get that money, that are they really acting in your best interest when they're sending you to somebody that they're getting commission from? Basically, do they have any duty of confidence required there, or duty to act on your best behalf? Because they say they're working for you, but you're not paying them. Do they really have that fiduciary duty on your behalf? And the example I use, and again, say something that some people don't like, the ROBS program, the Rollover for Business Startup program. Mm-hmm. Look, if you have $2 million in your retirement and you want to invest $250,000 and roll it into a franchise, I'm good with that, right? When you have $400,000 in your retirement and you're 60 years old and you're rolling over all $400,000 into starting a franchise, whoever led you down that path I'm sorry, should be in jail. That's, to me, my opinion is, you would never give that advice to a true friend or a family member.
So will the broker bill now move across the country? Do you expect other states are going to have similar protections?
I think some states might, not all states. Texas probably won't, right? But, the good part with California is that's 10% of the country. And while we complain about all the regulations and everything, it grows at a pretty good franchise rate, especially if you consider our population is allegedly going down. I still kind of question those numbers because traffic keeps getting worse. So how does traffic get worse with less people? I think it will in some, but I think, brokers who want to sell more across the country how many people want to give up California, especially if they're on the West Coast? So I think it'll weed out some things and correct some things, which I think is good. By the way, we always talk about how horrible, the regulations were, and people always point to California. So I always remind people the first state franchise law was the California Franchise Investment Law in 1970. Who was the radical left-wing governor who signed that into law?
Yeah. He became president of the United States.
Yeah, that wacko left-wing Ronald Reagan guy.
Yeah. So you make a very good point that we say, and we do have federal regulations for franchising, but the document, the franchise disclosure document, says right up front, nobody has read this, and it hasn't been registered in an FDD office of the United States government. You're on your own here. We require franchisors to disclose this information, but we don't check on it. And yet, there are about a dozen to 15 states where they do read the information, and attorneys general do follow up with the franchisor before approval for the state of New York or California, Wisconsin, etc. Do you prefer then buy in a franchise state-regulated situation as opposed to buying in Texas or Florida, the leading states in franchising, where we don't have state regulation?
It's interesting. Well, you're probably going to buy where you live, right? I mean, it's not like, geez, I live in Wisconsin, I'm going to buy a franchise in California. I guess Wisconsin actually does look at it, bad example, I guess.
Yeah.
They're one of the states that, in fact, posts the FDD. I always laugh when franchisors say, well, we can't give you an FDD unless it's like, are you kidding?
Right.
Most of them they're public document.
Right.
There's nothing.
Not hard to get.
Correct. I would more, it's funny, again, I think I said it earlier, I more look at where franchisors are selling, and if they seem to be avoiding registration states, that's almost the red flag I need, right? It's kind of like, why are you avoiding? I know it costs more, but it also tells me, you're not really willing to make that investment to have things proved. And so, I think it's safer, and I think it's also safer because a couple of those states actually will take action, like Maryland. Actually, Indiana did on one case recently, and Indiana tends to be one of those quieter states, I guess, and it's a very red state. I always go, it's not just blue states that go after bad franchisors. And we talk about the regulation. Federally, the only regulation is pre-sale disclosure specific to franchising. And I think we have a lot of things that franchisors do after you sign the franchise agreement that can be bad. Now, being bad may or may not be illegal, but there can be bad things. So,
Which state gets it right, or the closest to getting it right in terms of protecting franchisees while not making it impossible to be a franchisor?
Well, I would say California because I've helped pass a lot of the law and have written it. I mean, one of the things, speaking of pre-sale disclosure, in 2020, I pushed the law through in California, and one of the most important, it had some both relationship stuff and pre-sale disclosure stuff, and one of the things was getting unenforceable these waivers, questionnaires, non-reliance things, because that's become a get-out-of-jail-free card for some bad franchisors who, look, we all know if you have nothing in financial representations in item 19, when you're selling a franchise, you can't give people numbers of average unit volumes or whatever, which is one of the reasons why the broker bill was needed, was because it's questionable if a franchisor has nothing in item 19, no one at the franchisor can say what average unit volumes are. If a broker who's an independent contractor says, well, I hear the average unit does $1 million a year, have they violated the law or not? And we fixed that with the broker's bill, as the broker's bill said, yes, you have violated the law. But almost everyone, when you sign a franchise agreement, like when you're tired signing all your mortgage documents, oh, this is normal, and you're signing away, one of the last things they get is this kind of checkoff sheet. Sometimes it's a checkoff sheet, sometimes it's signature, that you have not relied on any information outside of the FDD or the franchise agreement. So even if the CEO wrongly told you AUVs were $1 million, you just gave him a get out of jail free card with relationship to you. Now, a state or federally, they could still take action off of him if you prove it, but you can't individually. In California, those are now unenforceable. So if someone said something wrong and you can prove it, they get held to it. So states that are probably have better what I would call protection laws, obviously would be California. And look, if you look at the rate of investment in California versus population, I bet it's not much different than the rate of Texas growth based on population, because their population's growing, ours is allegedly sinking. It is interesting, by the way, federally, if you look at numbers on growth in franchising, they don't seem to change whether Bush is president, Obama's president, through the years. The only blip was because of COVID, which was an unrelated thing. So when we say administrations are bad for franchising and stuff, it doesn't seem to play out in the numbers. Washington has a very good law, both, some interesting things in Washington that aren't always enforced is, one, if you take rebates, the franchisor, you have to tell the state you're taking rebates, I believe on an annual basis. I may not be right in that, but that's not being enforced. It's also not being enforced that brokers actually have to register in Washington, and that's not well enforced. Iowa is known for having a pretty good law. It's also interesting, I know I get calls from people who are having problems, right? Nobody's calling me and with what I do saying, oh, by the way, I just wanted to tell you, I bought the greatest franchise in the world. I've been in it 10 years. I'm super wealthy. And there are those people, right? They're not calling me in general. So I know I got a level set, a bias there. But I did about 6 months ago, same weekend. And I tend to get like 5 calls a week from people just randomly that I've never heard of saying they have an issue. Can I help, direct them to a lawyer or whatever? And literally over the same weekend, I had 2 people call me. And when they're from Texas and they both say, well, I'm having this problem. And well, first they tease me, oh, you're from California. Oh, I'd hate to be from California. They got regulations on everything and da-da-da. And both of them tell me their problem. And at the end of it, I said, well, if you were in California, I could tell you how you could be helped. Yeah. Yes, you've been screwed. Good luck in Texas. So, we always hate regulation until we need it. And we're all hypocritical to a point on politics. Silicon Valley bank went under, right? Did it go under because of too many regulations? Yet most of its investors were rich, very conservative, high-tech people who then all demanded that the government cover their full deposits, not just what was insured. So,
So is the FTC pro-franchisor or pro-franchisee?
Depends, I guess. The IFA will argue with me on this. I would say they're pro-franchise. They really are. They try to tie statements to the FTC, but I have never heard anyone tie labor, for example, and franchising from the FTC. Other people are putting words in the mouth. And the FTC has worked with the NLRB on other things, but they really haven't with franchising. And I've never heard, when he was a commissioner and now at CFPB, Rohit Chopra, always almost start out saying franchising's a great business model, especially for minorities, immigrants, whatever, to come into this country and see that American dream.
Yeah.
And I think they believe that. One of the statements made, and I've seen a couple people repeat it, is like, oh, it'll be great to have the FTC stop these job-killing regulations. Can you name one regulation over the last 4 years that the FTC has come out with? Look, they came out with the biggest statement ever on July 12th. And what did they come out with on that day? They came out and said, we've determined that it is a improper, unenforceable contract provision for you to have in your contract something that says you can't talk to a governmental agency if you believe your franchisor has committed a violation. Okay, is there any franchisor or any of us who want to say, no, franchisors should put things in their contract to silence people from going to the FTC if they believe an unlawful act happened and that you should be retaliated against? So that's one thing they said. The second thing they said was you can't charge fees that weren't in your disclosure document. And my comment to that is, if a franchisor can unilaterally add fees at any time, whether through the ops manual or just add them unilaterally, what good is disclosure, right? Now, I get that over 20 years times change. My solution to that is you just can't do it unilaterally. You have to come to the franchisees. If there's an association, come to the association with the business plan of, we need a new technology fee because this is what we're going to build with it. This is the benefit to you. This is what it's going to cost. And oh, by the way, we're going to be transparent and show how that fee was spent, not just go into this black hole. That's number 2 of what they said. Number 3, they listed what I'll call the dirty dozen, 12 items of concern. They didn't even say they were illegal. They did say, if you're doing some of these things, we may consider them a violation of Section 5 of the FTC Act, which basically prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. So those were just kind of like a warning shot saying, here's the thing. So what regulation have they come out with that has killed jobs?
Well, I like what you said, open your eyes. I think it's not only applying to older folks like us who might invest in franchises. Everybody, you're going to invest in a franchise, open your eyes. There are lots of opportunities for you to open your eyes. It's not difficult to do that. You can discover a lot about franchising before you invest, but you got to open your eyes and do it. Keith, thank you again for all of this time and for this knowledge and information. I wish you the best, and I appreciate you spending some time with me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Franchise Hot Seat Podcast with Dr. John P. Hayes. Tune in next time for more conversation around all things franchising.